Dave Monk, your Prairie Monk, WAFT Champaign 90.1 on your FM dial.
And Dave on the board. This is Sunday, November the 4th, 2018. And yes, since you're listening to the Dave Monk program, Prairie Monk right now, that means that it is not noon, which your clock might be telling you. It is 11 because we fell back because of getting rid of that oddity of daylight savings. And I've got to say, it was a beautiful bike ride getting in here. It's already over 50 degrees outside, and the fall colors are still out there. There are plenty of leaves out there. And if you notice, it's getting a little bit damp out there. In the 15-minute bike ride for me to get here, my jacket just has little splotches of rain on it. So it's a great time to get out there and enjoy what left we have of fall. And, yes, this is the Prairie Monk program, WEFT's weekly look at rails, trails, greenways, and everything else that Dave has been up to for the last week.
So I think I want to say that I'm not a fan of time change. Europe is getting into it. It does things to your biorhythm. It puts people out of whack. Everyone has to run around and change their clocks, and you have to wonder if medical people are involved with that sort of thing. It's man-made manipulation of the environment, and I'm not very enthusiastic about it. It always takes me about a week or more to get used to it. And I don't think it's something we should continue with. 3 states don't do it, and I think it should be a national change back to nature. So, okay, that's what I want to say there. This week we had an interesting graduation of the Master Naturalist. And let me get Dave to say something about it. I thought it was rather wonderful. And I got to speak for a little while.
Well, it was a fantastic graduation party. They invited any current master naturalists who've completed the course, plus all the volunteers who were helping with our class to be there. Our entrance song as we paraded into the room to get our diplomas was a bunch of people playing kazoos. And the people who weren't playing kazoos were blowing bubbles on us. So it was the perfect graduation. The University Extension has at least 2 classes. If you watch Channel 12, WILL, at least monthly, I think, has a TV program on gardening, and it's hosted by master gardeners, people who've gone through a course of classes where you learn about cultivars, the plants that we have around us that human beings have propagated, that we've created. There's a comparable class for master naturalists, which is everything in the state of Illinois that people weren't responsible for. How did the soil get here? What about the geology underneath all of that soil? What about the native plants and native animals that are around us, and weather systems? And the really coolest thing, you can take this class throughout the state of Illinois. Different parts of the state have their own instructors who will teach you the material, but there are also 20 chapters of a book that explains the stuff to you. And many of the people who wrote the chapters for this book that's used throughout the entire state live in this area. And so when you take this class, they're the people who instruct you on their specialty. So when we had a 3-hour class on Illinois' weather and climate, guess what? We had the Illinois state climatologist explain Illinois climate to us. It was just amazing. He's one of the people who wrote the chapter, and then he lives in Champaign-Urbana, so he was the logical person to have come and talk to us. The only downside of it is now you have to wait for an entire year. It starts in August, and it's 1 day of a week. You basically have to be able to turn over one weekday, pretty much an entire business day from 9 in the morning until 4 in the afternoon with time off for lunch. And seriously, that whole time, except for the lunch break, is people who are going to explain insects and amphibians and reptiles. I never really knew what the difference was between them, but I had to learn it because it was part of this class. And so, yes, if you're interested in the world around us, and you have one weekday next August, September, and into October to devote to this, it was just an amazing, amazing, amazing experience. It's the best thing that I've done in I can't think how long.
So there were about 30 people there, I think.
Well, our class was only about 20, which they said was really unusual because they're used to having, as you said, 30, maybe even 40 people in a class. So this was an off season for them. There were only the 20 of us who were taking the class. But again, there were almost that many people who came back for the graduation, and we all had potluck lunch together, and I had the best time talking with 3 folks who've gone through the class 5 or more years ago, and we talked about who their presenters were, who their teachers were, what they've done with the degree since, whatever the program since then, and they had lots of questions for the 2 of us who were graduating there too, to find out what we'd gotten out of it, what we were going to do now that we've got it. Just so you know, to be called what they call a master naturalist, not only do you have to complete all of the sessions of this class, which is 10, 11, 12 days of learning, you also need to put in 60 hours of volunteer work. Now, I do a lot of work with Heartland Pathways. That might cover my 60 hours in a year all by itself. And then once you have attained master naturalist status, you have to keep volunteering at least 30 hours a year from then on, or you lose your master naturalist status, for what that's worth. It should be pretty easy. I mean, they're really good about letting you know what's going on every week. The Urbana Park District, the Champaign Park District, all have volunteer opportunities for people to get out there and help them, probably through the winter, I've got to think. So, yes, if you're interested in the natural world, the Illinois Extension Master Naturalist Program is there, ready for you. Watch for it next October or August. If I think of it, I'll mention it a year from now, so that people who might be interested can sign up for it.
Well, for experience, you might add that you get some other experiences, like putting in a bridge on a little rill on our prairie at Rantoul, or working with students, or doing physical work.
That's in fact one of
taking down trees so that the bus that went through would not scratch its duco.
That's right. No, one of my favorite things from working with you, Dave, has been when you've got either the U of I students or the 4-H young people come out to the various prairies, and we find things for them to do. We just had a conference 2 weeks ago, I guess now, and I specifically took the 2 classes, 2 one-hour sessions on learning how to teach people about nature. And one of them was specifically about children, and I actually got to put it to use yesterday. I work at the Orpheum Children's Museum, and there was a birthday party there, and the birthday child wanted to learn about our reptiles that we have there, and I actually got to use the material, the class that I just learned from 2 weeks ago, to know these were 5-year-olds. Dave, keep it brief. They don't have the attention span to learn everything, to want to learn all of the things that I could have taught them about turtles and bearded dragons and a gecko and things like that. So keep it to 10 minutes, and we were done.
Well, David had asked if I could come speak, because usually there's a lineup of volunteer organizations that you can belong to and get your experience with. But they didn't do that quite this time. But I got to have 10 minutes and then a little bit more when they had supper. It was, I thought, rather fun and interesting. And I think it fulfills a real need. There are people who really want to be involved with the natural landscape. A few years ago, I had inquiries because people would finish with their master gardener and say, well, we don't really know much about the nature. And so that's why the natural master naturalist came into being. Some of this may have come from the fact that for years we taught a reading the landscape course at Parkland, and we had sometimes 29 people enrolled in that, and we did field trips fairly regularly. And David's, the Master Naturalist program, did field trips to a number of different places. Can you say just briefly what some of the field trips were?
Absolutely. One of the great things, they were as little as going over to the Anita Purvis Nature Center, which, I mean, I've been in BC Woods before, but we had 3 of our class sessions, I think, over there. And during breaks, you could just go out and walk through either the little park where it's kind of set up for kids to go out and witness a little bit of cultivated nature, you could say. But then you can go into the woods themselves, and there were plenty of birds. There were blue jays out there, and squirrels were all going crazy and having a good time. Did not see any deer. But yes, one of the fun things about the class then is they moved us to various places. We went out to Homer Lake for one of our sessions. We were at the Middle Fork. We actually waded around. One of the classes was the fauna that live in streams, moving waters. And so we were out there wading around in our shoes and galoshes and whatever people were wearing. And we had nets, and we were pulling in. Somebody found a soft-shelled turtle, and lots of other midges and things like that all over the place. And we also, again, so that was the Middle Fork, and I'm missing at least one place that we went to, but yes, there was at least one more place. I guess that's about it, Homer and the Middle Fork, and then again, just across town over in Urbana. Again, getting you out there so you could witness how many different things that there are around here, and it's public land, and so you can go out there and experience nature right here in near the city.
And for people who come from mountainous areas, this is a very flat community. They don't think there's a variety, but a 6-inch rise can sometimes mean different species. And so it's not as flat as you really think it is.
And even if it is flat, we had Mike Jeffords tell us one of the sessions, there are 14 distinct biomes, I guess you would call them, distinct types of both elevations, types of soil, wetness of soil, temperature ranges, things like that. So that makes Illinois one of the more diverse states because we stretch so far north to south. You've got fairly southern temperatures if you go to the southernmost.
Cypress.
Yeah, exactly, and water tupelo and things like that. Trees, yes. So there are plenty of types of plants and animals that you wouldn't expect to see in far northern Illinois that are routinely seen in southern Illinois and vice versa, because we're such a long north to south state. All part of this class in the course of 60 to 70 hours, just the amazing amount of stuff you have to stop and think about, besides just the words that people are telling you, the facts that they're tossing at you. When in the early days of the planet Earth, Illinois was sideways, not north to south, and we were below the equator. And in the course of all of those masses moving around, we ended up making a pilgrimage, and we're now in the center of the North American landmass. And we know this because you can actually find ancient fossil records of when we were a coastal area. It's hard to imagine Illinois being coastal, but again, the fossil record doesn't lie, so it's all out there. Just amazing things I never knew. And one of the great things about the class is you can go back and take it as often as you want. So when Mike Jeffords does this section next year, if I've got the day free, I can go over there and listen to him do it all over again.
Well, there was also glaciation, and so some of the more recent diggings will come up with mammoth bones and things like that. So, just trying to think there. We really encourage it. I've been thinking that there seems to be a need for preservation of the very few remainders of prairie that there are. So I came across a sustainability requests for proposals, and so I've been writing that, and it would have to come from the university. It's a university proposal. It has to involve senior professors, and it ranges. They are interested in interdisciplinary things and group activities. So their adjudication of your proposal would involve a lot of things, like David was talking about Jefferson Post. So that involves mass media, the Jefferson Post both put together books that relate to this sort of work, and with wonderful pictures. I can remember the front page of one of Jeffers' books has butterflies on a alligator, and they're taking juice from a little pores that are on the alligator's nose, and so just those sorts of pieces of information are interesting. But we do have a shortage of prairies. The North American Prairie Conference was held here last year, and Roger Anderson has just sent us electronic copies of the proceedings. And one of the advanced comments that Roger made, he's an emeritus professor at Bloomington, where the conference was held, that there's very little prairie left. It mainly has gone to farming. And we also have people like Jack or John White who are interested in appraisal of ecosystems, and their comment is loudly and clearly that we, as a state, have formally preserved 0.01% of the prairie. And David has a little story about that. There was a speaker speaking, and he didn't really know.
Yes, he's my mentor for the class. It's Mike Davis is the head of natural areas. He's the coordinator for natural areas for the Champaign Park District, and he was there for our graduation day to give us one of our last pep talks about ways that you can volunteer and things. And he was up there and he was trying to remember what percentage we still have left of prairie, and I raised my hand and told him 0.01. It got a good laugh. It was actually one of the questions on our final. One of the different areas different parts of Illinois do this class differently. And I got to meet with a woman who was actually taking it by way of Decatur, and she said her class isn't going to take a final, didn't have a final. Something about being in the University of Illinois zone, I guess. They felt that they had to make us do something to prove that we had actually learned something in the course of 10 weeks. But yeah, we had a good laugh because here's somebody in charge of natural areas, and we got to tell him it's only 0.01% of our prairie is left here.
That's good. I am thinking of the University of Northern Iowa, where the whole university has an orientation to prairie. There's prairie gardens here, there, and everywhere, about 17 of them around the campus. And there's an undergraduate and graduate program with the staffing and with people who have serious qualifications in prairie preservation. And they have lots of plots of prairie plants so that they can be harvested, and they can investigate harvest techniques and methods to prepare seed. For instance, we have a ceanothus, or a New Jersey tea, plant, and it needs to be picked, and often with a lot of trash of calyxes and other things with it. And so they will allow it to sit in the sun with muslin over it and allow the seeds to dehisce with heat. And then once they've got the dehiscence over, they put that into water, and the heavy seeds drop to the bottom and the trash floats. So you can sort that out. And some people have hammer mills that just will not crush the seed, but just go down to the level of breaking the trash around it. Sometimes you need certain techniques to encourage the seed. You might have to vernalize them, let them be cold for a while. And there's other techniques where you will actually have to put rhizobia bacteria on the legumes so that they will get the nitrogen-fixing bacteria there. And they have somewhat of a small museum in a sense of prairie. And we're in a region where we basically have 3 very small cemetery prairies with up to 80 species in them. And that's really the main gist of our existence as far as prairie is concerned. That's not much. Most of the remainder is on railroad right-of-ways. And those right-of-ways have been subject to deregulation in the Reagan era. A lot of organizations were allowed to deregulate. So that meant that quite a few of the small lines were abandoned. But those small lines carried most of our remaining prairie. And those lines go into rail trails. And that's been very interesting because we did some of this buying of rail trails 10 years before there was a Rail Banking Act, so we don't have the facilities that go with the Rail Banking Act. But the Congress, Federal Congress, was impressed with the fact that they were probably losing too many railroad lines to get networking across the country. They also observed that bicycle people were buying these railroad beds and having some problems. First of all, there was a federal mandate that when you abandon a railroad, you took out the bridges. If you have a reasonable stream, that can cost you $2 million to get a bridge back in there. So bridges were preserved, the titles were preserved, so that you didn't have an invasion of the corridor, and that was justified on the basis that the locals can buy the railroad line, but the railroads, if they want to come back in, can buy it back. And then they gave money that was enhancement money, developmental money, and it was quite considerable because the railroads realized that if they were going to put these unique corridors back in again in, say, 50 or 100 years, they were going to have a huge amount of opposition. Can you imagine going through a town and buying up land for this sort of thing, or going through somebody's farmland? So they're prepared to put quite a lot of money into preserving the railroad bed, using recreational bicycles and hikers, and also with vegetation in mind on these corridors. When the Rail Banking Act went in, Heartland Pathways took out an interim trail use agreement with Conrail and the Federal Surface Transportation Board, and that has enabled, that was the initiation for the Kickapoo Trail, which has gone in. The difficulty is that money comes with constrictions or apron strings for the style of bed. And there's the bed, first of all, you have to take up the rails, then you have to take up the ties and remove the trees that have grown since the abandonment occurred. And then you have to put a cap on the remaining possible creosote, and you have to do that down the sides of the ballast. That means by that time a lot of your prairie has been dissipated. And then when you have railroad lines, they were the first to bring citizens. First of all, you could come up the rivers at flood time, but then you had railroads And then there were roads that mostly paralleled the railroad lines. So Route 150 to the east is parallel to the rail bed, and when it was widened, that also took prairie out. So one of my concerns is that we should work with the rail trail people to see if we can get an easement that's not too wide. There are dictates, and some of them are EPA, Environmental Protection Agency dictates, or ADA, American Disabilities Act, for wheelchairs and the like. And but we figure that the loss of the prairie, it being down to 0.01%, these trails, there's 30,000 miles of them throughout the U.S., but in the Midwest, in east central Illinois, the Kickapoo Trail is the first long-distance trail. And the reason for that is that the soil under the railroad bed is good prairie soil, and it's valuable to farmers. So there's always a lot of opposition to taking out a trail. We've missed like 56 miles between Decatur and Peoria, but mainly because of the opposition. Sometimes it's claimed that it's a matter of privacy, but that's usually not the real issue. It's called a rape and mayhem syndrome, like you arrive with a bicycle and take the refrigerator or the TV set or the like, and it's an excuse for basically wanting that land back as agriculture. Land that looks like prairie, looks like weeds, looks like it's not being used, is accused of being wasted. And so there's a tremendous attempt to take it over. You can take it over by squeezing into it and leaving the trail in the middle, or you can take it over in total. And we have one person that has done that. But we have to think about a trail in the Monticello area that runs adjacent to Allen Park, and we have seriously resisted the idea of a trail on that corridor, because over 30 years the prairie has grown up onto the ballast. And it's very interesting that you can go to an old railroad line, like an interurban at Rantoul, and you can find the drier species have found their way up onto the ballast, and they grow very well. And over time, they produce their own organic matter, and gradually they survive. So where that has happened in the Monticello area, we're reluctant to take a trail through that. One of the problems is that the people who are prepared to use a trail are not always aware of the value of the plants on either side. So they tend to do wheelies across the mound, which is the ballast. And so one of our objectives would be to encourage the sort of things that are happening with the master naturalists. And I go back to the University of Northern Iowa to encourage people to understand their heritage. It's tremendously important. So one of the things that I would like to see is that the master naturalists take out a sustainability project that would encourage an interaction between already existing agencies. As David was talking about the 14 ecosystem in Illinois. That's called the Illinois inventory. I've got it here somewhere. But it's part of the Illinois Nature Preserves Commission, part of George Fell putting together the Nature Conservancy. We have locally a lot of the activities that David was talking about, the weather, the geology, the mass media. So we have the opportunity to put together here something like what you have in Iowa that lets the general public know more about what it is that their heritage is. You also have to know that sometimes trails are for fairly affluent people. If you run a trail through a town where there's lots of bicycles, they're not usually moving from place to place. They're doing wheelies locally, and so the trails are used by people who can buy a bicycle in the first place and then dress themselves accordingly. And so there's quite a bit of research to suggest that trails are not for everyone. But then you also have to think about the prairie itself. Do we have lawyers that stand for a big blue stem or a plant? How are we representing those creatures? And do they deserve to be stomped down upon, or do we need to preserve them? You can do both, but you have to have people who are well aware of the ecosystem with its 110 species, and the railroad beds aren't the best for this sort of thing. They're narrow but that's all we have. So we locally need those corridors for local interaction. We do have federal prairies. One at Manhattan, Kansas, has enough room for buffalo. There's another Ian Smith or Walnut Preserve at Colfax or Prairie City, Iowa. But not very many people are going to be interested enough to go to those places. We also have a restoration on the Kankakee swamplands in the Indiana and Illinois area north of here. And that's a little closer, but you need the local things. There are reconstruction prairies like the Meadowbrook or Barnhart, or some of them are private and some of them are public, and that helps you. But it is nothing like the bacteria and the fungi and the soils and the creatures that you get in the remnants prairie. So we're very jealous of the space that is extra in the Rantoul area, where we have the main line with prairie on it, and then an interurban with prairie on it, and a road, old abandoned old 45, which also has prairie on it. And then we have a gravel pit area that we've bought. And then beyond that, there is the extra space of a dual highway that didn't get to be a dual highway because the 57 went in. And that corridor runs all the way to Paxton, and it gives insects a wonderful opportunity to interact with the landscape. And I was up there on Monday with Ron Slater, and he has an interest in ecology and entomology, and so he can point out the insects that are starting to take the advantage of that extra space. And if we had our brothers together, we could buy 6 acres of farmland that's not being used next door, and then the cemetery nearby has history, and the cemetery has bought 6 acres of farmland for reserve for the burials in the future, and they put in a prairie, which is very nice. It's an understanding that we're next door with a prairie. And then on the southern side of that prairie, there's a wetland which is not being used, and it's loaded with teasel, but it's representative of the outwash plain part of the Bloomington Moraine, and we need that transit that goes from wetland where the melting glaciers would provide water and swampland, and then up Mesic, then to the top, where there's actually quite a lot of loess blown across from meltways after the glaciers retreated and the meltways dried up.
By the way, up at the very top of those moraines, you might find Catlin as the soil type.
Yes.
You've got Drummer at the bottom, Flanagan on the slope, and then at the top, Catlin. Something I've learned in the class. Once again, take this class, and you'll know this stuff.
A katina for this range, and it's very true. And you have some history. You have Ludlow, which was a town that was a terminus of the Illinois Central before it got to be down to Champaign and through the state. And then you get to an outwash plain creek for the Paxton Moraine. And so in the long run, we would like to think about taking a car off at Kankakee and going to the Iroquois Conservation Area, where the sand dunes due to glacial dry up and blowing sand across the country, and the species is totally different, and then bring those people down and give them a kiosk to interact with, to go to Loda Cemetery and to go to the railroad bed outside the Loda Cemetery, which is rather wonderful, and then to go to the towns, which were usually about 5 miles apart, which was about enough for a horse to pull grain into a elevator from the field, and so just that interaction means that we have around town a lot of examples of preservation possibilities, sociological interests, economic interests. When we put in a trail, there is an economic value to that. If you have a restaurant at the end of the trail, you just might benefit from the trail. So, so in that framework, I'm looking for a proposal that might be for a PhD, or perhaps not so much a PhD as someone who is prepared to join Extension and go out into the community. So to work with one foot with the Prairie Institute, the Natural History Survey, and look at the state support. You've got the state with the Illinois Nature Preserves Commission, and the INI, which is the Illinois Natural Inventory, those 14 ecosystems that have worldwide standing. You have quite a number of other groups, the Natural Area Study Group, the Grand Prairie Friends, plant preservation groups, all interested in helping, but they all have some slightly different way of getting together. It hasn't been easy to bring those people together. In a broader environmental situation, there's been quite a number of attempts to bring together those agencies. And they come together for a specific issue, like PVCs in a landfill or something like that. But they tend to move apart. So it needs something like the University of Northern Iowa has, to bring people together and to create a regional interest in the like of 56 mile of railroad abandonment in the Arcola area, which is unfortunately going back to the farmers without them really knowing that this is rich in prairie. It was bought by the Department of Natural Resources for a trail, but really the most important part for us has been the prairie that's on that corridor and the prairie soils that haven't been disturbed very much. There's herbicide drift and there's creosote drift, and yes, it's not totally undisturbed, but it's still much more undisturbed than the adjacent fields nearby. And so losing that reminds us that we should have some organization that will help us in the future. So let me just run down a few of those. I was looking at some of our slides, and Busey Woods is in there, and so we don't need to forget that we had a prairie state. It was a prairie county, as 94% prairie, but we also have trees, especially on places like moraines where the trees have drainage. Trees usually, except for the likes of cottonwood, don't necessarily want to be flooded with water. They like water, but they like to be well drained. And so your trees will be along river corridors and on moraines that are well drained. But there's a prairie forest ecosystem, so we need to know that balance. And we do need to plant prairies, because that lets people know what the prairie looks like, but it also provides a habitat for creatures. And if once you grow a Meadowbrook Park, you're going to have creatures in there, and you're going to go back to a prairie. Doris Westfield has a prairie in the Vermilion County Conservation District, and that is, she's put so many species in it, and then it's matured over the years that it's almost like a remnant prairie. It's the remnants we look for most, and when I go into Busey Woods, I'm looking at the woodland side of the prairie, and the outwash Plain Creek that comes down and through it, and it was cut off. It was an oxbow lake, and last time around David found a nice picture of an oxbow, and it had been operating for thousands of years, so there were what the Australians call billabongs, or cut off meanders that are wetlands, and they're vernal ponds, and they have all sorts of creatures in them, and so Busey Woods has some of those sorts of things. And if you want to find a salamander, you can find the salamander in the old river scars, where it's a little more damp, and the trees sort themselves out so that the bur oaks will be in a lower situation than, say, a red oak or a white oak. So even though we have not a great deal of range of elevation, we do have species that sort themselves out according to the rise and fall. And so it's very tempting to plant trees of any indiscriminate nature into those prairies, but really you should know enough to not to be planting a tree in the wrong place. It should be where there was a forest and a forest soil, a podsol, that had been leached to the point of there being a soil profile. So what David is talking about as a master naturalist is very, very helpful, because you start to understand, and you start to look, instead of just riding past brownfield woods or treeless woods, you start to look to see what's going on there. And you might want to just kick in the soil sometime, because there might be Indian arrowheads. So this terrain is flat here, but in Vermilion County and Piatt County and Macon County and DeWitt County, there's some terrain, and so you get a lake, a Clinton Lake, and a Weldon Springs, and you get a Vermilion County Conservation District, and so you get a Piatt Forest Preserve. You have to know that the Forest Preserve has more mandate for recreation than does a conservation district, and that means conservation district can do more to preserve the prairie along the railroad lines. So I'm just toying with this idea that there might be a master naturalist with perhaps a headquarters somewhere where there was a nucleus of people that were permanently appointed by the university to look at and preserve the dignity of the prairie. That a fellow named Gleason came here very early, and he collected a lot of specimens in various locations and found places that were sandy, one of those 14 ecosystems. We don't know what happened to Gleason's prairies. They were invariably taken over, and no record was made. So we had subsequently we had ecologists, Coles and his daughter May Watts, and then we had Vestal and Shelford, and lately again Kendi, and those people had a student named George Fell, and he put together the Nature Conservancy, encouraged by his mentors, and a lot of this is relatively hard to do because you are doing things that are different from the norm. You're asking people to tolerate a prairie alongside a farmland, or trees that might hang over a crop and reduce a crop value because of a shade. So there's a lot of resistance. So you can be very much regarded as not a very friendly soul for wanting to do this. But we have to have those people who will press the point and go to the university and say, we'd like to do this sort of thing, and the master naturalists help people to empower that sort of arrangement. And then there's all those Audubons and Sierra Clubs and others that can put in their spoke too. And, I like that. Okay. So one of these days I'll encourage you to go back into Busey Woods. I was looking at my photographs, and I could tell you where the tree was, which tree died. Before that was transferred to the Park District, I had some degree of control over that woods, and many of the trails were trails that were there very early, but some of them were trails that we created. And they've been boardwalked so that you don't have to walk through the mud. And some places that you do walk through the mud. Some places you can go down to where there's been landfill and attempt to fill in that area of Busey Woods. And it's a place which is where birds often like. We have it on Route 45 North. There was a place where thousands of birds would be, and now that has to be development, and so those birds have had to find their way into places like Busey Woods. And now, when you look at the sky, you see aluminum plains. You don't see birds. The bird population is going down, 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 down very quickly. And as climate change comes, then those birds are going to be in difficulty. And our trees and our prairies don't get up and move easily. So things are going to change, and and there's so many humans that they're a J-curve. And if lemmings can increase to the point where they all of a sudden eat up their environment and they die, that's called a J-curve. And humans can go into a J-curve too. A few will remain. I think we're at time. This is Dave Monk, your Prairie Monk, WEFT Champaign 90.1 on your FM dial.
And Dave on the board. As always, the views and opinions expressed are solely those of the speakers and no one else.